Have you ever wondered why so many people doubt God, even when experiencing moments that seem impossible to explain? What if I told you that perhaps you have already witnessed clear signs of God's presence, but simply didn't notice? Think for a moment. How many times has something happened in your life exactly when you needed it most? How many times has a situation seemed completely lost, and suddenly something changed unexpectedly? Many people call this coincidence. Others call it luck. But there is a question that continues to echo in the minds of those who observe these things more closely. What if it's not a coincidence at all? The truth is that doubt about God has accompanied humanity for thousands of years. Even people who deeply believe in God go through moments when their faith seems to waver. When we face pain, loss, injustice, or silence in our prayers, it's natural to ask, is God really seeing all this? Does He really care? Perhaps you have felt this way. Perhaps you have looked to the sky in a difficult moment and thought, God, where are you now? But here's something interesting that few people realize. Often, the quietest moments in our lives are precisely those in which God is working behind the scenes. While we only see chaos, God may be organizing things we can't yet understand. And this isn't just a nice idea or a motivational phrase. Throughout history, there are accounts, experiences, and events that completely defy human logic. Think of how many stories there are of people who escaped impossible accidents. People who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but for some reason survived. Or people who were about to make a decision that would change their lives for the worse. And something unexpected happened that completely changed the course of the story. Some call it destiny. Others believe there is something greater behind it all. Now imagine for a moment that these events are not just isolated occurrences. Imagine that there is a pattern that appears repeatedly throughout the lives of many people. Moments when everything seems to be falling apart. And then something happens that completely changes the course of the story. Perhaps you yourself have experienced something like this. Perhaps there was a moment in your life when everything seemed lost. A moment when you thought there was no way out. But then something happened. An opportunity arose. A person entered your life at the right time. Or simply a situation that seemed impossible to resolve ended up falling into place in a way you never would have imagined. And it is precisely here that a profound reflection begins. One that many people avoid. Because admitting this means considering a possibility that changes everything. What if God is truly present in moments we don't perceive? What if what we call coincidence is, in fact, part of something much greater? There's a reason why so many people around the world say that. After certain events in their lives, they were never able to doubt God in the same way again. Not because someone tried to convince them with religious arguments, but because they went through experiences they simply can't explain. Experiences that defy logic. Situations where everything pointed to one ending. But the story took another turn. Moments when it seemed like nobody was watching. But something happened that changed everything. What if the truth is that God has always been present, even when He seemed distant? What if the problem isn't God's absence, but the way we look at the events in our own lives? Because when we begin to observe certain details more closely, we realize that some stories carry such striking signs that it's difficult to simply ignore them. And what's most surprising is that many of these stories follow a pattern that appears repeatedly over time. A pattern that begins precisely when all seems lost. And that's exactly why, before we continue, I want to extend a very important invitation to you. Pay attention to every detail of this video. Don't just watch it out of curiosity or or as just another piece of content. Really try to understand what is being shown here. Because many of the things we will explore can completely change the way you see your own life and even the way you perceive God's presence around you. Now, I want to know something from you. Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed impossible to explain? An unexpected deliverance? An answer that arrived at exactly the right time? Or a situation where everything seemed lost, but something happened and completely changed the course of the story? If this has ever happened to you, write the phrase in the comments, "God has already acted in my life." I really want to read what you have to say, because often people's experiences reveal something impressive. God continues to act every day, even when many think He is silent. And there's another reason I'm asking you this. When you share your experience or simply comment below, you might end up helping someone who is going through a difficult time right now. Sometimes, a single story of faith can be exactly what another person needs to hear to not lose hope. And if you enjoy content like this, which makes us reflect deeply on life, faith, and the mysteries that often go unnoticed in our daily lives, go ahead and leave a like now. This may seem like a simple thing, but it greatly helps the video reach other people who also need to hear this message. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Because here we explore stories, reflections, and events that show there's much more happening around us than what we can see on the surface. Often, details that seem small end up revealing profound truths that go unnoticed by most people. So do it now. Leave your comment, leave your like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Because the story we're about to analyze shows something so impressive that when you understand all the details behind it, it becomes very difficult to look at life the same way as before. In fact, this story begins at a time when everything seemed completely normal. There were no signs that something extraordinary was about to happen. No warning, no indication that the events to come would make many people question everything they thought they knew about coincidence, destiny, and even about God. But like many of the most surprising stories of faith, it all began with a situation that seemed ordinary. A simple moment, seemingly unimportant. Something anyone could have ignored without a second thought. The problem is that sometimes it's precisely these small moments that hide the greatest revelations. Because when we start connecting certain events, we realize that some stories follow a very curious pattern, a pattern that appears repeatedly in different places, different times, and in the lives of completely different people. And it is precisely this pattern that we are going to begin to explore now. Because when you observe everything carefully, you realize that some events carry details so precise, so unexpected, and so difficult to explain that ignoring them becomes almost impossible. And the first of these stories begins in a way that no one could have imagined. Precisely at a time when everything seemed perfectly normal. If God truly exists, why does it sometimes seem that He is silent? And this is a question that transcends generations, religions, and life stories. At some point, almost everyone has asked themselves this question. Perhaps in a moment of deep pain, perhaps on a silent night when the mind cannot stop thinking, or perhaps right after a prayer that seemed so sincere, so full of hope, but which apparently received no answer. It is in these moments that doubt begins to arise in the hearts of many people. Not because they want to stop believing in God, but because life sometimes places before us situations that are too difficult to understand. Think for a moment about how many people around the world are facing losses right now. Families dealing with unexpected goodbyes, people battling illnesses that seem unfair. Individuals who have done everything right in life and yet face difficulties that seem senseless. And in situations like these, faith is put to the test in a very real way. That's when the question ceases to be merely theoretical and becomes personal. Is God really seeing what is happening to me? Perhaps you yourself have experienced something like this. Perhaps there was a moment in your life when everything seemed to crumble at once. Plans that didn't work out, doors that closed, people who drifted away, or moments when you simply couldn't find an explanation for what was happening. And in those moments, even those who deeply believe in God can feel the weight of the silence. It's not easy to continue trusting when the answers don't appear immediately. And this experience is not rare or uncommon. In fact, it appears repeatedly throughout human history. Men and women of faith, people who have dedicated their lives to God, have also gone through periods when they felt that heaven was silent. Moments when prayers seemed to echo in the void. Moments when all that remained was to continue believing, even without understanding. But there's an important detail that often goes unnoticed when we think about these situations. Silence doesn't mean absence. Just because we can't immediately see what's happening doesn't mean nothing is happening. In many stories of faith, what seemed to be silence later revealed itself to be a period of preparation, transformation, or even protection against something the person couldn't yet see. Perhaps you yourself have looked back at some point in your life and realized that something that seemed bad in the past ended up leading to something better in the future. A missed opportunity that paved the way for a much bigger one. A delay that ended up preventing a problem. An unexpected encounter that completely changed the course of a story. These moments cause many people to start wondering if there is something bigger happening behind life's circumstances. If there is a presence that continues to act even when we don't realize it. Because when we begin to observe more closely, we realize that some experiences don't seem like simple coincidences. They carry such specific, precise details that it's difficult to completely ignore the possibility that God is present in ways that often go unnoticed. And perhaps that's precisely why so many people say that after certain events in their lives, they were never able to doubt God in the same way again. Not because someone tried to convince them with words, but because they experienced something that deeply touched their faith. There is a detail in the scriptures that goes unnoticed by most people, even those who have read the Bible many times. It's something silent, almost hidden between the lines of the stories, but it completely changes how we understand the way God acts. We often imagine that the great biblical events happened quickly, clearly, and miraculously before everyone's eyes. However, when we observe carefully, we notice something different. In many moments of the Bible, everything seemed lost, the silence seemed absolute, and no visible answer appeared. Even so, God was already working. This is a spiritual pattern that appears repeatedly in biblical stories. Before a miracle happens, there is almost always a period of silence. Before God's answer manifests, there are moments of doubt, waiting, and even confusion. And that's exactly where the detail that almost no one notices comes in. While the biblical characters thought nothing was happening, God was already preparing the scene, moving people, opening invisible paths, and organizing events that would only make sense later. Think for a moment about how many stories in the Bible begin with seemingly hopeless situations. Moments when everything pointed to failure. Circumstances where fear seemed greater than hope. In many of these narratives, the characters had no idea what God was doing behind the scenes. To them, it seemed like just another difficult moment. But when we look at the complete story, we realize something impressive. Every detail was already being aligned. It's as if there's an invisible mechanism working behind every event. And while people saw only delay, God was preparing the right time. While there seemed to be only silence, God was orchestrating the miracle. This is one of the deepest spiritual secrets of biblical stories, and few truly stop to reflect on it. Perhaps the most surprising thing is realizing that, in many cases, the biblical characters themselves only understood what God was doing much later. During the process, they felt fear, questioned, waited, and even thought they had been abandoned. But looking back, they realized that God was never absent. On the contrary, He was guiding every detail with precision. And it is precisely here that a detail appears that almost no one notices when reading these stories. In the moments when it seemed that God was silent, those were precisely the moments when He was most active behind the scenes. This pattern appears so many times in Scripture that it begins to raise a very powerful question. What if God is also working in your life right now, even if you can't see it yet? What if the silence that many people interpret as God's absence is actually the period in which He is preparing something greater? Because when we analyze these biblical stories deeply, we realize that nothing was a coincidence. Every encounter, every delay, every change of direction ended up being part of something much bigger that only revealed itself at the right time. But there is an even more curious detail within these stories. A small sign that appears repeatedly and that almost no one comments on when reading the Bible. And I want to know something from you now. While you listen to all this, Mulder, write in the comments, God is acting even in silence. Or if you prefer, also comment, I believe that God works behind the scenes. When we look closely at many stories recorded in Scripture, we begin to notice something that repeats itself in an impressive way. It's not just an isolated event, nor a spiritual coincidence. There is a pattern that spans generations, spans different biblical characters, and appears whenever the situation seems to have reached its limit. First comes the chaos. First comes the moment when everything seems out of control, when fear grows, when human logic can no longer offer answers. And it is precisely at this point that something begins to move behind the scenes of the story. Consider how many times the biblical narrative begins with an impossible scenario. A people cornered, a promise that seems distant, a situation that humanly has no solution. People's hearts are filled with doubt, their minds begin to imagine the worst, and the feeling is that God is silent. This moment is much more common than it seems within the Bible. In fact, it appears repeatedly as if preparing the ground for something greater. It's interesting to realize that almost always, before a great deliverance, there is a period of tension, a time when everything seems to stand still, a time when prayer doesn't seem to bring an immediate answer, a time when faith is truly put to the test. Many people read these stories today, knowing the ending. But those who were living through that moment didn't have that complete perspective. For them, the scenario was one of total uncertainty. And that's exactly where the second movement of this pattern begins to emerge. After the chaos comes God's intervention. Not in a predictable way, not following human plans, but in ways that often completely surprise. Unexpected deliverances begin to happen. Doors that were closed open. Situations that seemed defined completely change direction. This type of turning point appears several times in biblical narratives. Moments when everything seemed lost and suddenly something happens that no one could have planned. A change of circumstance, an unexpected response. Help that arrives at the exact moment. And when we look back, we realize that what seemed like mere chaos may have actually been part of a larger process. This leads us to a very profound reflection. Because often, when we are living through our own difficult moments, the feeling is exactly the same. It seems like nothing is happening. It seems like God is silent. It seems like prayers are echoing in the void. But if the pattern that appears so many times in biblical history continues to hold true, then perhaps there is something happening that we haven't yet been able to see. Perhaps God is working even when it seems like nothing is happening. Perhaps there are invisible movements being prepared. Perhaps what today seems like mere confusion, delay, or difficulty is actually setting the stage for an intervention we cannot yet imagine. There is a very specific moment in the spiritual journey when something within us begins to change. It's not necessarily when everything improves, nor when all problems disappear. In fact, this moment often arises precisely after a difficult phase, when you look back and begin to notice details that were previously completely invisible. It's as if, suddenly, pieces that seemed loose begin to slowly fit together. What previously seemed like only pain, delay, or even abandonment begins to reveal a meaning that you simply couldn't see while you were experiencing the situation. And this is an experience that many people report throughout their spiritual lives. During the process, everything seems confusing. Prayers seem unanswered, paths seem closed, and doubts begin to take up space in the heart. It is during this period that many people wonder if God is really listening, or if there is some purpose behind so much waiting. The problem is that while we are in the midst of the storm, our vision becomes limited. We only see the present, only the weight of the situation, only the silence. But something curious happens as time passes. Years later, or even months later, you remember that difficult moment and realize something surprising. Some of the things that hurt the most were precisely what prepared you for something bigger. That door that closed may have prevented a wrong path. That wait that seemed unfair may have been exactly the time you needed to mature, learn, or develop strengths you didn't have before. Many stories of faith illustrate exactly that. People who, at a certain point in their lives, felt they were being left behind, but later realized they were being led down a different path. A path of preparation, because there is a huge difference between being behind and being prepared. But we often confuse the two. And this is where something profound begins to make sense. Silence doesn't always mean absence. Delay doesn't always mean denial. In many moments, what seems like emptiness are, in fact, a time when something is being built behind the scenes of our story. Think about how many times something that seemed like a problem ended up becoming a learning experience. How many difficult situations ended up strengthening your faith or changing your perspective on life. At the time, it seemed like just suffering. But later you realized that a process was taking place. Perhaps that's why this phrase touches so many people so deeply. Sometimes God isn't silent. He's writing a part of the story you can't see yet. Because when we understand this, something changes within us. Anxiety diminishes, faith takes on new meaning, and we begin to realize that not everything needs to make sense immediately. Some answers only appear after we've traversed certain paths. And now, I want to know something from you. While you were listening to this part of the video, did any situation from your own life come to mind? Any difficult moment that only made sense much later? There comes a point in the journey of faith when everything seems to reorganize itself within us. It's not necessarily when everything is all right, when the answers are clear, or when life finally makes sense. Often, this revelation appears precisely when we are going through chaos, when the questions are greater than the certainties, and when the heart seems tired of searching for explanations. And it is at this point that something profound begins to reveal itself. A truth that many people go years without realizing. God has never been a distant observer of human suffering. For a long time, some people have imagined God as someone who merely looks on from afar, as if watching the history of humanity unfold without truly feeling what we feel. But when we look closely at the deeper spiritual message of Scripture, we perceive something entirely different. The story that runs throughout the Bible shows a God who not only sees suffering, but who chooses to enter into it. A God who draws near to human pain instead of avoiding it. A God who walks in the midst of our silent battles, even when we think we are completely alone. This completely changes how we perceive life's difficulties. Because when we understand that God is not distant from pain, but present within it, something begins to transform within us. Faith ceases to be merely a religious idea or a spiritual custom and becomes a real experience. Hope begins to blossom precisely in the places where before there was only fear, doubt, art, or a feeling of abandonment. Perhaps you've experienced moments where you silently asked, "God, are you really seeing this?" Maybe you faced nights when it seemed like no prayer was being heard. Many people watching this video have felt exactly that. And if you've ever experienced something like this, know that this question is part of the spiritual journey of millions of people throughout history. But there is something powerful that we often only realize after going through these difficult times. It is precisely in the midst of crises that God begins to reveal purposes that were previously hidden. Situations that seemed only suffering gradually begin to show signs of transformation. People who have experienced losses find a deeper faith. Broken hearts discover a strength they never imagined they possessed. And stories that seemed marked only by pain end up becoming testimonies of hope for others. This doesn't mean the pain disappears immediately or that all questions are answered at once. But it does mean that life's chaos isn't the end of the story. There's something happening in the spiritual background that we often only perceive when we look back and understand the path we've traveled. Perhaps you still have doubts about God. But after realizing how He acts even in the chaos of life, it becomes impossible to believe that we are alone.